Okay. Awesome. So I guess we'll start off. I got about maybe 10 questions, but we'll probably be able to answer some of them together, I would think, depending on, just how closely related some of the answers are.
Mhm.
Um, but as we've all seen, online church has become a bigger and more popular venue for churches to start exploring, especially in recent years with the introduction of the church online platform and early adopters like Elevation Church and Life.Church and things like that. So more specifically, what does this look like in your context at Grace Community Church and within your role?
Yeah, so about 2 years ago, we started digging into this question of what does it look like to plant an online church at Grace Community, and we did a little bit of research. We became aware of what was out there. Started with the life churches of the world and the elevations of the world and stuff like that, but really began to dig in and ask, okay, how can we? And then it quickly became the first question was, what do we want to emulate? Well, I mean, I guess the first question was, do we want to do this, right? So the question of do we want to do this was a fairly simple one, and what I mean by that is uh, it came down to really two major points, and that was the first major point was kind of if America was an unreached people group, if the nation of the United States was an unreached people group, and you were coming in cold with the gospel into whatever America would be, right? If it was fully unreached, you would look at the way we relate to each other, you would look at the way we talk to each other, and you would say, oh, 2019, at that time 2017, America is, people are connecting in online communities. People are, that basically the smartphone has become the remote control of our daily lives, right? And you would look at that and you would say, well, whatever we do, we have to be there, right? We have to natively exist on the 3 or 4 platforms where people are spending 70% of their time, being with any level of variance: YouTube, Instagram, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and emerging is, TikTok as a platform. So asking, what does it look like for us to exist um, in those spaces? And then as a secondary question, when you look at the way people connect through online community, you look at something like Twitch, where people are building live stream video game communities, around these individuals who have built, empires, so basically, around their brands. And even something as simple as, podcasts, right? So you look at something like I think Pod Save America just did a tour, you know what I mean? And they're not somebody I particularly like. I've never listened to an episode of Pod Save America, but they're probably among one of the more popular podcasts, and they're doing national tours where they're bringing people together around the common interest that shared nothing other than consumption of content. So what becomes obvious if you zoom out is people are building community, people are building lives around things that aren't necessarily things that they're able to visit, right? And this isn't a new fact, right? There are millions of people who watch maybe not millions, there are thousands of people who watch the Chicago Bears, right? And they come together around bars or around in people's homes from time to time for big events. But for the most part, their interaction with the team is watching them at home on their TV. But they are very much a part of a fan community where if I were a Bears fan and I met another Bears fan in line at the gas station, we could have a conversation about the Bears. We could have a conversation because we share a common language, we share a common experience because we're watching the same thing, right? So it becomes obvious that people are forming community this way and people can form community this way. So that was kind of point number one. Sorry, that was a little long-winded. Point number two was, I think, really an idea of a point number two would really be the idea of what does it look like to reclaim a medium. So if we look through Christian history and we ask, has Christianity ever used a medium well, like used a new medium well? And you think like, okay, the spoken word was how the gospel was initially shared until like we wrote it down, right? And then, you know, written books, initially like handwritten books, you know, or I guess really the spoken word, because handwritten books are pretty rare until the printing press. We use the spoken word really well, right? Christianity becomes this extreme power in the world, whether you know, regardless of your feelings on the westernization of Christianity and all that type of stuff, like the Edict of Milan, whether it hurt or helped, that's another topic for another day. But this idea that the spoken word was this medium that was used very well. And then the printing press comes along, and around the time of the printing press comes this guy named Martin Luther. And I think what's interesting about Martin Luther was that he was kind of, first of all, a propagandist, in that, like, is like we're very lucky that his ideas were accurate, because I think he would have won even if they weren't. And so he like sees this new medium of a printing press and realizes that he can win an idea war if he could just out-educate his opponents. You know what I mean? So he says, well, I could put the Bible in languages that they understand, and it will naturally create a hunger for, you know, the proper explanation of the gospel. And again, I'm speaking from a Protestant perspective, obviously. But if you think of Martin Luther from a Catholic perspective, he was like a propagandist who used media well. You know what I mean? And he basically, like, kind of, for lack of a better phrase, out hustled the Catholic Church. And so we fast forward. And when you see that as kind of like a communication revolution, which is what the printing press was, we fast forward, the next time we see that would be like television, right? Like, so, and when you talk about television, there's you know, Fred Rogers becomes a significant figure there, where he was this PC USA, I think it was pre-split, but he was this Presbyterian minister who asked to have a charge to create children's programs about kindness and about empathy and about things like that. And his belief was, his story is that he looked at a TV and he said, oh, this is such a beautiful medium and it's being used so poorly. And so he decides to kind of go out and redeem this medium, and he becomes, you know, Mr. Rogers, right? And so when we sit here in, you know, the 20s and the 2010s and, you know, the 2020s, we are sitting in the middle of one of the biggest shifts in communication and marketing that the world has ever seen. And if that's true, we ask ourselves, like, well, what does it, and this is one that honestly the church is like pretty far behind on, right? Like, you still go to some church websites and they're not just like poorly done, that they're objectively poor, like, you know what I mean? And when you realize that, you say, okay, well, like, if this is where people live, and if leveraging new platforms has proven over and over again to be a way to get the gospel into more people's hands, and to get more people, you know, if you subscribe to an Arminian viewpoint, right, to get more people into heaven, right, you would say, well, of course we would ask ourselves how we could leverage this medium. And so the two-part answer being, I forget what the first part was already, but what did I say? Oh, the first part being, yes, people are forming real community online. And then the second part being, okay, then if they're forming real community online, I believe that, based on what I said about reclaiming mediums, you could argue that we not just have to, we almost have a moral imperative to to generate online content. Now, whether or not that means like we bring a church service online or we just look at what it looks like to use YouTube well as a church. If you go to YouTube right now and you search the phrase, I don't know if this is still true, but it was true not long ago. Actually, we can screen share and we can find out. So let me do that real quick.
No, it's okay.
So if we screen share here and I open Safari and I search and I go to YouTube, and I search the phrase, where are you? Come on, help me out. I go to youtube.com and I search the phrase, how to study the Bible. And we look at the results here. Okay, how to study the Bible demo and tips. Well, this is probably like a PhD in Bible study who could really like help me lean into this, right? And we click and we look, we skip ads. Okay, it's a girl who maybe we don't know her credentials, right? She could be a PhD in Bible study, but it's like. But if we look at, who this girl is, she has 465,000 subscribers. She does a vlog. She's a female Christian vlogger. And it kind of goes between, okay, so this is probably a mom blogger, right? You know what I mean? Like, and who knows, again, if we go into like, the about me section. But the point is like, this isn't, it's unlikely that, I don't want to say it's unlikely she's a pastor, maybe she's a pastor, but in the fact that none of her videos talk about that, that's one thing. And then we go here, we get, okay, this is coffee and Bible time. Here's my study and an in-depth study of, and this is pretty clearly a teenage girl, and again, more power to her. She's doing something that, churches aren't doing. And we continue to, I don't know if that audio is coming through, and it's probably terribly annoying if it is. And then we get an R.C. Sproul video from, it's in 4:3. So somebody ripped a VHS of R.C. Sproul and did a lecture on how to study the Bible. So that's something that if you're going through and you're not a Christian, here's a male Christian vlogger called I'm Listening with Justin Coe. And so, we read the description. And the point is without like going too far into this, here's a video of Joyce Meyer from, God knows what that's from. The point is like, we're not even here. You know what I mean? Like this should be a space where if it is the responsibility of pastors and teachers of the Bible to shepherd people, then why is it that when I search the phrase how to study a Bible, it's a space dominated by, verified YouTubers and people who, now this is not, I feel like this is coming across the wrong way and I don't mean for it to. I feel like it's coming across like I'm saying you have to have credentials to teach people to study the Bible. That's not what I'm saying.
No,
Obviously,
but we would expect that like alongside these would be additional like reputable people from like the academic world or from churches or something like that also lending a voice to the same topic in addition to what we're seeing.
Right. And my point is that in a world where millennials and Gen Zers are spending an obnoxious amount of time on YouTube, if we're honest with each other, when I have to fix my vacuum or when I have to fix my washing machine, I Google my washing machine's making this sound and I find a YouTube video of a washing machine repairman who is selling me washing machine parts and showing me how to fix my washing machine. Well, you would say, well, why did he go out of his way to do this? He went out of his way to do this because he runs a shop that sells these things. And he said, all right, if I provide value to people, then I'm going to become their source and I will use that money to feed my family, right? Like that's kind of the base level of it. So the question is like, okay, if you're a pastor and you genuinely believe that people having the correct information about God can lead them to a decision that will keep them for an eternity of suffering, then wouldn't it stand to reason that would try to win a seat at the table in their lives by any means necessary. And if somebody is wondering, man, how do I interpret Romans 5, or how do I interpret, the verses about an idol feast in First Corinthians? Like, I don't even understand how that applies to me. Like, and if they search YouTube and they say understanding First Corinthians 9, like, what are they going to get? You know what I mean? And again, no hate on Melina. I feel like I came off as sexist, and I didn't mean to, because that's totally not me. But like, just the fact that it happened to be like, no hate on Melina Ciciotti, or Coffee and Bible Time, or Legionnaire Ministries and R.C. Sproul's, or I'm Listening with Justin Coe, or whoever Jack is, right?
If anything, it's like good for them, because they're
right.
providing something that we're agreeing is helpful and necessary, and they're doing something that, it's like, hey, leadership in the church, you're not doing this, but people want it, so I'm filling that space.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, good for them for trying, right? You know what I mean? But this video has 200,000 views. You know what I mean? And it's like, man, there is a hunger for people to understand the Bible, and we're not even like somebody who wouldn't say, I have a vocational calling to ministry. Somebody who, if I'm sure, I don't know that about this woman, right? But like, or even the guy who does it, right? Like he has Christian Blogger here, so like, it's likely he wouldn't say, I have a call to pastoral ministry. Maybe he would, but I don't know. But like, here's people who would not say, I have a vocational call to reach the lost, and yet here they are trying their best with what they have. And churches instead are kind of sitting on their hands and saying, well, we can't figure it out, or we can't like learn this, or we can't unpack this. But the truth is like, 17-year-old kids are running successful YouTube channels. You know what I mean? Like the ninjas of the world started with like an Elgato Stream Deck, and you know what I mean, and just plugged it in and got going. And I just think it's disappointing and disheartening that the church is just choosing not to have a voice, when there really is, like, if I own one of these guys, I have all of the tools in my possession to create this content, right? So I would say that's kind of the we're only more popular. What does this look like in context of Grace Community Church and your role? So what this looks like in context of Grace Community Church is kind of an evolving question. Step one was, let's create a service online where people can go. But I think step two becomes, what does it look like to create content for an online audience? And that's something we're kind of wrestling through right now. And I'm kind of formulating the vision for, because like we launched the online service 2 weeks ago, and there's been some cool stuff that's happened as a result of that. But we'll get into that if, as the other questions address it. But now I'm kind of asking myself, okay, our church is going through a Bible study, or our church is going through reading a chapter of the New Testament a day for the next, couple of, for the year, sorry.
And that's across campuses.
Yeah, everybody's doing it. So like, what does it look like for, like, again, me having like a master's of arts in theology, I could like sit down and I could like unpack, like, hey, this is why Luke was written this way. This is what to look out for as we transition into the book of Mark. Like, it has like this pacing, and it has like, it was written to this audience and stuff. And, creating that primarily for our people, but also creating, a series of videos that become a resource to people who are just like thumbing around YouTube.
Right.
So, yeah, sorry, very long answer to the first question.
No, that's good. That's good. So just to clarify that, like, the next question would be, looking at, you mentioned YouTube, you mentioned Instagram, Facebook, even TikTok. How does the church online platform different from those services? And I guess, how do those services, those additional ones, those kind of like Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, do those kind of play into what you guys are doing with the online church?
So I would say our long-term vision is, and anybody who's creating content would, I think, answer this question this way, is you have a content pillar that is your primary piece, and then you use pieces of that to fuel kind of everything else you want to do online. So going back to like the Twitch streamer, right? If they have a weekly show where it's like um this week in Madden, right? And then they have a section of the show that's like tips on how to play better. If they know, and this is true of the guys who did this week in Madden, but when they used to do it, there's a guy named Zach Farley and Steve Gibbons. They would take individual sections. So they would say, like, they would do like a mailbag, and like if a question was like, well, how do you defend Gun Bunch Week? You know what I mean? And then they would do a video on how to defend Gun Bunch Week within their weekly show, right?
Hmm.
And then they would take that and they would put it on like Twitter later that week, like, hey, we talked about how to defend Gun Bunch Week and this week in Madden. They're not creating original content twice. They're taking something they already did and they're creating like a YouTube piece for it that's like a small segment of it. So I would say that in terms of interplay, that's probably the goal, is that we would create content for YouTube that feeds kind of what happens in the service. That might be clips of, if the pastor goes off on a tangent and talks about this subject, like we grab that and we use it on a YouTube type thing. Or like I said, if I create a series of videos for people to understand as we read the Bible together, well, we also forever have a chapter by chapter, expository analysis of Mark, you know what I mean, that we could create, repackage in other ways and stuff like that. The Church Online platform, really, the reason that I go with it is because it's a little more difficult to access than like a YouTube or Facebook Live, which I think helps us to better measure what like it helps us to better measure what people are actually doing as they interact with our stuff. And if they're showing up to something that is they're not showing up at the Church Online platform like by accident, you know what I mean? So that means they're actually, in my mind, like kind of leaving the place they came from and going to this new place, you know what I mean? So that's kind of my thought process on why we use the Church Online platform. The Church Online platform is also specifically for churches, so it allows us to create some links like, hey, here's our bulletin, here's our Connect card, here's more information about, you know what I mean? And it's a safe space that's a little like, you're not going to get as much like random trolling or something like that you might if you were just like throwing it out to Facebook. Now, with that comes its limitations, right? You don't have like as much kind of infinite shareability and all that type of stuff. So
Yeah, I guess that this isn't on the list, but that is something that you'll see a lot on online communities, especially on a platform like Twitch that you've been talking about, like people coming into a thing and just trolling or just trying to, start something up. And the way that those people will deal with that is they just ban them, right? Because that's the
right.
acceptable way to deal with those people in that sort of situation. And obviously you have like chat moderation and rules and stuff like that. But the online platform is so much easier for people to just say whatever they want without feeling like there's any sort of real repercussions. And even if I get banned from a chat room on an online church, like I don't really feel the weight of that like
Right,
you
you could
would
just
socially
you can
if
make
some
another
secure
account.
right but like if you're in an actual church and you come in there and start shouting profanity or something like that, and they have security come over and ask you to leave or whatever, and you're taken outside or something like that's much different, right? That's a
Right,
much
right.
so is that like something that you guys have like a special like attention for? Like how do you deal with that sort of
Well, we haven't
interaction?
needed to yet. I'm not sure when and if we will have to. Obviously, the hopes is that we don't. You know what I mean?
Right.
But if it happens, I think you can just delete comments and you would just try to keep up with it. And eventually, like as people aren't, getting engaged when they're acting like that, they're eventually going to excuse yourself. I think it is possible to mod out that type of stuff because like if you go to Life Church at any given time, they run services every 2 hours, and I popped in there a lot just to see what's going on,
Mhm.
and I've never seen them,
Right.
you know, um, doing that type of stuff.
Right. Yeah. That I would assume there's just a heavy amount of moderation that you can have in the back end where it's like
Yeah.
if anything like that happens, it's not like a public scene that's
Hmm.
occurring, unless
Hmm.
you really unless somebody drew attention to it. But
And
um
honestly, the chat is pretty easily ignorable
mhm,
in that context. So
right. Okay, well then we'll move on. So let's see. Yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about this just now, but in what ways are there challenges facing the development of launching an online campus, and how is that different than starting like a traditional campus?
oh, I think there's significantly less risk with an online campus, right? Because like we're only about, we built out like a studio in order to do it, but are only what, $6,000-7,000 deep. You know what I mean? Where if you think about that, if you think about it just from a very practical aspect, like that's what, like 4 months of that's 3 months of rent. You know what I mean? If you were to
Right.
like rent a space, or if you were to finance a space, and you have a 30-year mortgage or something. So just from that aspect, like that's it. And obviously, you could do shared space, you can rent a school, you can do church on the move and all that type of stuff. But the risk is way less there, if you will. Um and then I think if there were like kind of another piece, it would be, um there is the inherent challenge of like, there's a guy who's been attending our online campus named Douglas Bear, who I've had conversations with him, but I've never like seen his face. You know what I mean? So the challenge of like developing a person to person connection, you can kind of meet somebody once in person and walk away saying like, oh, we really connected. You know what I mean? But like in like an online environment, like it's, we connect in the chat. I say, hey, good to see you back. I don't really know like how connected he is, and if he comes back, I mean, I guess we connected. You know what I mean? But it's a little more like obtuse, if you will.
Hmm.
And then I would say another challenge would be you are tech dependent. You know what I mean? So if somebody can't, it's pretty rare that you're going to find somebody who can't unpack the idea of entering a building. But like we've had several people who are like, hey, I tuned in on YouTube, and online church looks great. It's like, oh well, that's not really our online church. That's just like our live stream that we feed into our online church. But like trying to help people over that mental divide is challenging. You know what I mean? So I would say that's kind of the tech issues. I always like to kind of summarize my answers. The tech issues, the personal connection challenges, and then like the idea of just getting people through the idea of, hey, this is a space where you can develop community, which obviously I'm pretty passionate that you can, but I think that there are challenges unique to that, such as it's just harder to measure. You know what I
Right.
mean? And you need to find ways to measure it. And also, like, one thing we found just over the first 2 weeks is like people will come for like worship, and then like 15 minutes of the message, and then we'll just like leave. And that's like kind of weird because that doesn't really happen in a physical location, right? Like people don't
Well,
like
not
come.
visibly, right? Like they
Right,
might
right,
tune
yeah.
out, but they're still present in the building, even
Right.
if they're
They don't leave the room like
right,
in
right,
the middle of the second point. You know what I mean? So
right, right.
that's been interesting. And I think what we're finding is the people who are fully engaged and are filling out connect cards and stuff are staying for the duration.
Sure.
But if your propensity for distraction, I think, is much higher in the online environment.
Yeah. Um, so to introduce the next question, I'll say this, that like one of the technologies that's developing, especially, with online video games
Mhm.
is they're streaming video games to platforms now instead of having a physical piece of hardware in your living room. You just have a small, like basically Roku size device, and then all the hardware is somewhere else. But by doing
Oh,
that,
right.
every input that you give to this little console, basically this tiny little box, has to be gone through online. And so
Right.
they're able to measure that, they're able to track it, they're able to see exactly what, the average reaction is to this thing happening or that thing
Right.
happening, right? And so this is like this. So we see the same exact thing with online viewership, as you're talking about, like, being able to say the person watched the worship and then 15 minutes of sermon, then tuned out. But you can go back to that exact spot and see, so are there other things like that? How do you take advantage of those measurements, and how is that an advantage over a traditional church?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, I would say it's tough because it's tough to call it an advantage, I think, for me, because, when somebody, I'm also a youth pastor, and like, I would say a big part of our goal is like, hey, let's get people to just sit in the room and we'll see what happens. You know what I mean? And so I think when I sit there and say like, how is it an advantage? I guess like, yeah, we could audit. Okay, how are we losing people and what do we do to correct that? Right? Like, but on the flip side, it's like, man, I'd really rather it not be, um, tremendously challenging to like what number do I use? You know what I mean? Our peak concurrent was 33, but by the end of the service we had 20. Like, which number is real? And stuff like that. So I guess, yeah, I mean, in the long term, if we find, oh hey, 25 minutes in we lose people, like what does it look like to re-engage, or what can I do from a chat perspective or something, to keep people kind of engaged throughout the service. Yeah, I think that the targeted auditing is helpful in a sense, but I would say that it's more a challenge than an advantage.
Mm.
And yeah, you're describing Steam's new console, right? Like that's
The
that thing you
Google
just released.
Stadia,
Oh,
Stadia.
okay. I
That's
didn't
what I
see
was.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But Steam has a similar thing, but Google Stadia is like the big one that's coming out. I mean, I think anecdotally, I think like PlayStation and Xbox are also going to have options like this, but
Mhm.
Google's like testing out the waters. It's heavily dependent on having like really good internet. So
Right. And well, that's the problem, is I think like sometimes we don't realize, living in like kind of the east or in like metropolitan areas, like there are still areas in America that like really don't have great internet. Like, you know what I mean? Like you just can't get it
right,
anywhere.
right, right,
And when I did like work in like the Appalachia region and stuff, I was like, hey, do you guys have internet? And they were like, no, it's too expensive. Like, it's just, you
right,
just didn't like, because the only option was like very expensive, like satellite internet or something, and it sucked anyway. So,
right.
um,
Yeah,
so
I guess I see it as something that like you could not only find ways, okay, how can we re-engage through chat, but like what is it that, because you can't tell when someone's sitting in a pew and hears something the pastor says and suddenly is like tuning it out because they're
right,
offended, right?
right. That's
Like,
true. That's true.
so I mean, unless you have like someone scanning the audience and looking for some sort of body language, facial reaction or something like that. But like even that, you're just using conjecture. But like when you see people dropping out of a chat room or dropping out of the online church, and it's like at a specific point multiple people just drop, you're like, oh well, what was being said at that point that maybe rubbed people the wrong way, or maybe we can like address that again at the next service and say, just to clarify something, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah, that's an
you
interesting
you
question.
you can use those things to kind of get a better feel for how people are responding to, specific parts of the service. Maybe if there's like a call to give or something like that, and people just start
Yeah,
checking out right there, well, hey, the way we're approaching this to people is turning them off. How can we do this in a way that's less offensive, but still making a point of encouraging them to participate in, the spiritual discipline of giving to the church, so um, that's kind
yeah,
of where I was going with that. But I think my question kind of illustrates like the point. So it's less of a question, more so than just the
yeah.
observation.
Let me show you real quick what the analytics page looks like on the back end.
Sure.
So there's that. And are you able to see my mouse?
Yeah. Yeah. I could see your
Okay,
mouse.
so you could see like this is when we started 10 minutes before the service. This is at 9:15 and we're at 33. 33, we bump up, bump up, bump up, and then this is our peak concurrent at 40. This is this
Mm,
past weekend, and you can see we like held pretty steady. This is probably about our worship set's about 15 minutes. This is about 30 minutes into the sermon, like 55. We're still like fine here, and then you really don't see a drop off until really like the last like kind of go as he's starting to close. You know what I mean?
right,
And
right.
then you just see people kind of saying, "Okay, I've heard most of the sermon. I'm out." You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So as opposed to, I think we saw a steeper drop last week. So last week, this is kind of how it went. Our peak is right here at 25 minutes at 48. So, and then the interesting is like the average time attended. So like the total against how many things went on. So you'd see average time attended went down a little bit,
Mm,
but that could be any number of things, right? That could be like it could just be like we held a greater number of people for longer. You know what I mean? Like it looks like we still had 23 at the 75-minute mark, as opposed to we had 19 here. You know what I mean? So
hmm
we have a
right,
steeper drop right here. So yeah, I mean, you could look at this stuff ad nauseum and try to figure out like what happened.
right, right. Yeah. I find that aspect of the whole thing really fascinating, and
Yeah, me too.
even if it's just like, that could benefit the physical campus as well,
Yeah,
because it's just so much harder to measure how engaged people are at a physical church.
I think we're finding a lot of stuff like it really does cause you to kind of revisit everything, right? Because like kind
Right.
of the camera doesn't lie, you know what I mean? So it's like if something came across weirdly on a stream, it's likely that it came across weirdly for most people in person, you know what I mean? So
Right. Right.
so yeah.
Okay. We'll move on a little bit.
Yeah, no,
Just
we
to
can keep
do.
trucking, man. I'm good.
Okay. So I was reading through the FAQ and I saw a mention about, like, obviously if you feel led to come and visit the physical campus, it's great, but there's obviously a desire to see people really commit to an online community and feel like that's their home. Is that correct? Was I reading that right?
Yeah, I would say there's a desire for people to find Jesus.
Well,
And
yeah.
if that, no, I know that sounds like I Jesus juked you, and I didn't mean to. What I meant though was like I think that's it. You know what I mean? So sometimes that will lead to them coming to Grace Community Church. Sometimes, as I pastor and disciple them, it's me saying, "Hey, you have some unforgiveness to work out with your previous pastor, and I really think you should like your next step in discipleship is going back to
Mm,
that man or that woman and and working out what happened there, like because you were at a church that was preaching the gospel, but you're just like you're using us as like an out, you know what I mean?
sure.
Or alternatively, if somebody was like regularly attending in person and then all of a sudden they disappear and start attending online, you ask the question of, okay, well, what's happening here? You know what I mean?
Right.
Are you taking a step away from fellowship? Is this, you know what I mean?
Or
Um,
are they just sick or something, and not expressing
right.
that need. Yeah.
Well, right. And that's what we've seen a little bit is people will come on and say like, "Hey, please pray for my knee replacement." And it's like, "Oh, we didn't know you were getting surgery." And so
Right.
then they get kind of picked up by our existing pastoral care systems. So I would say that what we want to make sure to get across there is we're creating a path to the kingdom, not a path to Grace Community.
Hmm.
And so sometimes what that looks like from person to person will vary. And as we personally shepherd people, um, assimilation into an online campus looks like asking ourselves if there are volunteer positions that people could fill from home. Like, could we have people, I don't know, proofread social media posts from home? Could we have people, you know what I mean? There's like, kind of 100 different questions of like what we could do with the time and the space.
Right.
But it really varies.
Yeah. Are there,
Um,
like, I guess,
I'm
this
sorry, I
is
have to
tight.
send. I'm going to listen to you, but I have to
Yeah.
send a quick text. I apologize. You can
No,
keep
no,
talking,
it's
but
fine. Um, Kind of tying this question about assimilation into the online church, into the next one, like, there's certain core values that exist at the church, at any church. Everyone has core values. So how do you hope that the online community experiences those church values? Is it is it nuanced in any way? Like, does it, look different, but still, present the same value system? How would you explain that?
Yeah, to be perfectly honest, I'll need to pull up our church values real quick because I
That's
don't know
okay.
them off the top of my head. But because I'm sure that we have staff values that are stuck in my head and I can't really get them out. So let me look up, because I think most of them are beliefs. Maybe that would be what I designed the website. I should know. So about us, who we are. Okay. So our values are biblical truth and preaching and teaching. That one's pretty easy.
Right.
Compassion for one another and the broken world. Again, pretty easy. Passion for evangelism and discipleship. Like, again, pretty, like these,
Right.
grace in our relationships inside and outside the church. Again, just online relationships, and authenticity in worship and ministry. I think anytime you're creating an online space, you're going to struggle with authenticity,
Mm.
or at least that's going to be the rub that people bring up. But what I always say to that is something you've kind of danced around is, we need to be careful not to. The way that I've phrased it is, don't compare the perfect in-person attendee to the worst online attendee you can imagine. And what I mean by that is pretty obvious. Like, when we think about it, we think about guy who sits in the fourth row and makes eye contact with the pastor the whole time and nods his head and understands what's happening in the sermon, volunteers and all that type of stuff. Like, but if everybody's being honest here, that's not every church member. You know what I
Right.
mean? In fact, it's not most church members.
Right.
So if we think about then the person who attends once a month only when they're serving in nursery, and never comes to a church service otherwise, well, that person's not engaged at all. So for that person, it would be a step forward for them to attend online the three
Mm.
times that they're not serving in nursery and then come serve in nursery. Right. So the question of authenticity is really, regardless of whether you're online or in person, people are as authentic as they want to be. You know what I
Mm.
mean? Like, he's been in the news a lot lately, but like, Ted Bundy got super plugged in at like a Mormon church, right? Like, right before he got caught for killing a bunch of people. And like, if you'd have asked people who were interacting with him, they just said, "Oh yeah, he was authentic. He's a fun guy." There's like pictures of him doing like small group with people and stuff, and just having a good old time. But he was also a serial killer. So that, like, the idea that authenticity is somehow, we are as authentic or as inauthentic as we choose to be at any given moment. And that's true whether I'm having face-to-face conversations or whether I'm having online conversations. And I mean, I don't think it's something people are like readily willing to admit, but like, technology has changed us in a lot of ways, but in a lot of other ways it's exposed us, right? So the issue isn't like, so again, I'm going on a bit of a soapbox here, but like, the issue isn't like, oh well, Facebook makes me like compare my life with everybody else's like best version of their life. The issue is like, you aren't happy. You know what I mean? Like, the issue is that you feel like your life is missing something.
Mm.
So you run to technological spaces. Facebook gave you a space to express that, right? Like, and like, so it just magnified what was kind of already inside of you. But anyway, so that's kind of the now, like, there's a lot of research that says, like, Facebook and social media is rewiring our dopamine reward systems and all that stuff, and all of that is like obviously true. But in some ways, it's like, it's just amplified the stuff that was already true about us. Like, you know what I mean? People have always wanted to in some respect like run from reality, right?
Right.
But the internet has given them a space to do it, like, safely. You know what I mean? And like,
Right.
obviously, with the advent of internet pornography being a multi-million-dollar business. Like, it's a vice that I guess far more people were interested in than when it was exclusively available in stores. You know what I mean? But people didn't want to go into a store and risk like exposing themselves. So in some ways, I say all that to say, in some ways, people are more willing to be their true selves online, because they feel like they can duck judgment. So if somebody has a question about faith that they would never ask in person for fear of exposing themselves or for fear of having an uncomfortable conversation, would they have that conversation with me, an online pastor, under the guise of a screen name that I could never connect back to them? And is it better for them to have the conversation or not have the conversation?
Right.
And I think that's kind of the question that I've kind of overarched all of this is like, is it really better for somebody to not attend anything at all than it is for them to attend an online space? And I mean, I don't think anybody would say, well, yeah, no, it'd be better for them to not listen to any sermons than do it that way.
Right.
It's just not true. You know what I mean? That's the equivalent of saying, oh, well, if you're going to exercise using Beachbody on demand, you might as well just get fat and die. Like, you know what I mean? It's just like, it's a stupid argument.
Right.
But yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to kind of go off there.
No, it's fine. You're helping out because you're answering a couple other questions while you're going, so that's good. I guess some more like just like practical things, as far as like, I don't know, let's say someone wants to get baptized, like how would you handle that with the online campus? Would you encourage them to come to the physical campus to do that, or would you try like pre-recording it and showing it or something like how would that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we would do is let's get a space where we can baptize them. You know what I mean? Whether that's like, let's rent a room in a hotel and do it in a pool, or you know, let's find a way to do it, even if it's just 1-to-1. You know what I mean? And
Right.
we do record it and we post it online. I mean, it kind of goes back to like, that's a good problem to have, you know?
Right. No, of course.
Yeah. So I think you figure it out kind of person to person. So as I work
Right.
with this guy, Doug Bear, who came in, really cool story, actually. Our first week of online church, I don't really know how he heard about it or anything, but he writes in his connection card, he says, I have Parkinson's and multiple chemical sensitivity, and it's rare that like I get out of the house, and especially rare that I go to like a crowded environment. Thank you guys so much for doing this. And then the following week, he writes on there, is it possible for me to receive communion? Right. So for him, like if he wanted to be baptized, I mean, we would talk with him and figure out what that looks like. And I think it really is. I think it's interesting that I think we can naturally view online ministry as impersonal, when in reality it's more personal in a lot of ways. And I think an example is, so the other day I went on Twitter and I put like, oh man, I've had these Nike shoes for 2 weeks and they they're making this popping noise, and now I have to figure out how to return them without a receipt. And within like 20 minutes, somebody from Nike was like reaching out to me to like figure out how to manage the return. You know what I mean? Right. And it's like, that's incredibly personalized service, and it's service that was like completely impossible, like not even 20 years ago. So like, we like to pretend that online is like by nature impersonal, but the truth is that it allows us to have personal interactions en masse a little bit. It allows us to multiply ourselves, I think, more effectively.
How would you address the communion question from Doug?
So what we're going to do with him is, our pastoral care staff does every time we receive communion as a church, which our next time is March, we go out and we connect with homebound members. And what we will do is we will connect with Doug, and I'm going to say, hey man, every time we do communion with our homebound members, it's in March. is that cool, or would you like to do it sooner? And if he says, yeah, that's cool, just put me on the schedule for March, we would reach out to him. I would go out with like our pastoral care staff, because I've actually never done in-home communion. So I would go out and I would just kind of watch them do it. And then, and then in the future, maybe I can do it or what have you.
So that wouldn't be during the service. That'd be at a different,
It'd
like,
be at
scheduled
his home.
time. Yeah,
Yeah, it would
just
be
at a
at his
different
home.
time. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I think for online church communion, what we've talked about is the next time we do in church communion, we would just plan to pop on before it and say, hey guys, just making everybody aware, we are doing communion today. We encourage you to grab some bread and some grape juice, and you know what I mean, and participate in this with us as a family, or as everybody who's in your home together.
Right.
And yeah.
Cool. Let me see here. I had another question just about advantages of belonging to an online campus, like from the person's perspective. I mean, we've talked about like people that have, physical disabilities, or a temporary sickness or something like that. Is there anything, like, just from your experience or from your research looking into this, like, is there anything else that you would think would kind of be an advantage of the online campus for somebody given their situation?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about physical illness. There's also like mental illness, like if
Yeah.
somebody has PTSD, and crowds make them uncomfortable. We've had somebody say that to us, is where they say, hey, my wife wants to come to church with me, but she has anxiety and can't handle crowded spaces. Being in a room with 350 people sounds terrifying to her. What do we do? You know what I mean? And it's like, well, we have this online campus. The other piece would be people recovering from church hurt. So it's like, I'm not going to go into a church building because churches aren't safe. And I was hurt in this way, or I was hurt in that way. And it gives them a chance to say, hey, come check out our church in a way where you control the line. You know what I mean? Where if at any point you are out, you can be out. You know what I mean? Even if it's 15 minutes in the sermon and you say, no, never, I'm not going to do it. And it's such a safe connection point. And that's kind of where I see it is, Andy Stanley in his, I don't know if it's in his book or what, but when I listened to it, it was a series of podcasts, and this was probably almost 10 years ago now, but he was talking about, he has this theory on church management that they've applied at North Point, where they said, think steps, not programs. And his point was, like, if you have somewhere where you want someone to go, have a clear set of steps that gets them from there to the other. And he talks about the nature of these steps, is these steps should be clear, they should be easy, but they should be like challenging, as I think his three things. And when he talks about the easy one, he kind of creates this picture of, if I'm jumping across a stream and I'm trying to go from rock to rock to rock, if those rocks are in like a nice straight line, I can just kind of quickly skip across. If they're like leaps and bounds away from each other, it's a much more dangerous predicament for me. And I've always thought of online church as maybe creating a rock between two rocks for people. So if going to church is a step too far, we say, hey, we're going to create this for you. And kind of by accident, the weekend that we were launching online church, one of our pastors was preaching on the story in the Gospels where they tear the roof off to like kind of lower their handicapped friend. And he said, his friends decided that they were going to do anything to get him to Jesus. And he kind of said, kind of extemporaneously, he said, the reason we're starting online church is because we're asking, what does it look like for a church to tear the roof off of somebody's house? You know what I mean?
Right.
And Jesus looks at them and he says, like, because of their faith, you're made well.
Right.
In other words, the belief that if I can just get them to Jesus, he'll take care of everything else. And I think our thought process is kind of, if we can get in there, that's it. And I forget why that was an answer to your question. Hold on.
No, just talking about reasons why it's an advantage for some people. Like, we've talked about, I was just wondering if there was anything that wasn't necessarily obvious, right? I think it's all good.
Yeah. And then I
To
think the
illustrate.
other thing is, we have to remember when Jesus said, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few.
Mhm.
I think he meant it. And what I mean by that is kind of like, I think in churches sometimes we like to believe the workers are plentiful, but the harvest is few. In other words, we believe there's this subset of 20% of Americans who are ever going to go to church anywhere, and that's it. And all of the churches that exist have to compete over that 20%. And Jesus like intentionally tells us not to think that way. He says no, the problem is that we don't have workers. And so again, if an online church multiplies workers, then like why wouldn't it be a good thing? You know what I mean? It's like, if we use the harvest mentality, like again, if we like, this is a bit of a stretch, and this is the logic of this is easily poked into, but if we expand the harvest idea, we could say like, oh well, we can't use that piece of harvest machinery because that's not like real, like people, we didn't pick corn that way in my day, you know what I mean? Because you would say, well, that's nice, but we have mouths to feed, you know what I mean? And that's when I think like when we want to get fancy about like what church is and what church isn't, it's just like, okay, but like people are going to hell, right? Like we realize the game we're playing. Like we could be as fancy about it as we want to be, but at the end of the day, I mean, like we live in a reality where like how can they hear unless someone sends them, and how can they be sent if they have not, like, because beautiful are the feet of those who bring the good news. Like the goal is to have people hear the gospel, in the end of the day. And if we can multiply good preachers, or we can multiply good healthy church environments, or we can multiply, which like I think is safe to say, like people are lacking in, right? Like we've all been in church services where it's like, man, I don't know, this is I'm gonna sound critical for the second time. Like we've all been in church services where you're like, oh, I'm not confused about why this church is struggling to reach people. You know what I mean? And that, again, that sounds crass and mean. And I don't mean to be, but there are churches that are choosing to be small, regardless of what they might say to themselves, or regardless of what they might say. They might say, oh, we want to reach new people. And you say, oh, okay, have you considered this? Oh, we wouldn't do that. Why? Because that's just not how it's done.
Right.
It's like, okay, well, I mean, good luck. You know what I mean? Like, because my pastor actually said it really well, is somebody came up to him and said, Mike, I don't mind the contemporary music, but I'm afraid that we're going to have a whole generation grow up that doesn't know Old Rugged Cross. And he looked at her and he said, I'm much more concerned that we'll have people grow up and not know Jesus. You know what I mean? And the point is like, it's a crass way to tell that story. But the truth is like, man, I don't know how I feel about the theology of online church. Like, am I ultimately like right? Or am I ultimately like, is it real or does it count or anything like that? Like, I don't really know. What I do know is like somebody might find Jesus as a result of our work, or somebody like Doug might find, like, we might have built a church for him that gets to exist in his computer. And if that's true, and he grows closer to Jesus, and he shares the gospel with somebody who was on their way to hell, and because of their decision is now going to spend eternity with Jesus, I don't really care about the rules that somebody wrote in a book about what counts as church and what doesn't. You know what I mean? It's like, I
Just
don't
to be
know.
clear, you're not talking about the Bible. You're talking about somebody writing
Oh,
their own
right.
book.
I mean, like,
Okay.
right, like a book of like what is a
Yeah.
healthy church or
Right.
something, or
Sure.
like an
Right.
interpretation. Yeah, of course I care about the Bible.
Right.
Um,
No, that's good. I think going off of that could go into the next question of, you know, in your view, do you and like as platforms and things like this become more accessible to churches, do you think that online church is for everyone? And we talked about how some churches don't have good websites, some churches have no website, right? Very few, but let's say most do. Many churches have Facebook. Some churches have YouTube channels or Instagram, some TikTok, but like you kind of go fewer and fewer and fewer. Where is online church on that list of like, should churches, could churches, would churches, and like where do you see that, like as far as the next 10, 15 years?
I think every church should do everything they can to reach lost people. And I think that if I'm trying to not be mean because but I think that if you were selling baked goods in your community, there are things you would unquestionably do. You would have a Facebook page. You would consider an Instagram page. You would find out from your niece who's a millennial how to create like a functional website. You would build out, you would get t-shirts and build out a Shopify or a TeePublic or some crap. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
but why would you do that? Because the survival of your family depends on your business being successful, right? Like, and that's like very like marketplace. I get all of that. But if all of that is true and you and I would agree to that, yeah, of course, you have to run your business. That's how you run a business in the 21st century. Then why would we not apply the same fervor to helping people find Jesus? You know what I mean? And so my answer is, yeah, like whatever you can handle, I think you should try. And I think like you should stop being fancy. People say stuff like, oh, we can't write a blog because like, I'm not really a great writer. And what if it wasn't like that good? That good for who? You know what I mean? Like for who exactly? Because like right now you're doing nothing. Like I talk to churches sometimes and I say, well, like start live streaming your services and see if people respond. And they say, we don't have equipment. And I say, you called me on an iPhone. Like put it up in the back of your sanctuary, hit go. You know what I mean? Like it's like people are so fancy that like they let their idea, and it's funny because we would say this about the Pharisees in the Bible, right? Like they let their idea of what something should be get in the way of them just following Jesus or following God. I mean, if we're talking about the Pharisees, right? So like, I mean, I yes is kind of the answer to the question. Like, do I think churches should have an online platform? Sure, if they can. Do I think churches should be on Facebook? Yeah, I think they should try to. Do I think churches should be on Instagram? Yeah. Do I think I should be trying out TikTok with our church, even though it kind of makes me uncomfortable and it's weird? Absolutely, right? Like,
Yeah.
because the fact is it's, I mean, open TikTok and flip through it and like tell me if that feels like wholesome content that I want my youth students taking in, or would I like it if like 1 out of every 10 videos was like, hey, here's some verses you can read when you're feeling like God is distant from you. You know what I mean? Like I just
Right.
like
Right.
yeah, I would love that if that content exists. And here's like this, like I mean it's varying, it's getting closer and closer together, but every 5 years or so we get these like completely unsaturated platforms where people can carve out space for themselves. You know what I mean? And like YouTube, I mean, it's crazy to me that, and I say this as we're not using YouTube, but it's crazy to me that like more churches aren't like chomping at the bit to get on YouTube. Because think about like what church is.
Right.
It's like looking out to a group of people and speaking. You know what I mean? And like church and YouTube are basically the same thing. And we're already doing all of the hard work of figuring that stuff out. And church and YouTube are basically the same thing, and yet we're not kind of doubling down, if that makes sense.
Right.
So I think that we should, I think it's the Apostle Paul says, doing all things by all means to reach some, right? You know what I mean? So yeah, I think we should be using every tool at our disposal to reach people. Um,
I guess one criticism I could put in is just that, and I've read this in doing some of our research for this paper, is that there's an idea that as churches play out this space and as we're addressing certain things like, why would I go to this church or that church? Well, typically it's based on proximity or my preferences of what type of experience I want to have at that church, some sort of connection that I'm making through the spirit or to the family of the church that exists there. But that proximity piece is what's key. And the reason for starting more and more and more and more churches is because you only have so much bandwidth and a space to take in so many people. You only have so many people coming in from such a community. But when you do that online community, that breaks down so many walls and barriers where you're pretty much only locked into time zones. Like if you're streaming a service to the whole East Coast or something like that, or the entire US, because it's a close enough time zone to what you're trying to do, a whole North America. So like as online churches progress and get better and better, one of the, I forget the name of the guy that was writing this, but he basically said he's like his thought is that the ones that are really good, those are the ones that'll last, and everything else will be like, well, this is kind of a lot of time or effort for us to keep this going when other churches are doing it better, and there's no reason why the people that are living near us should be just tuning into that one because their value that they're presenting through that service is somehow better. So like, not saying I attribute to that. That was just something we were reading. But how do you view that going forward? Do you think that's like a fair assessment, or do you think it'll like still maintain its community value?
I think people will always do stuff in person. And I think that because if you look at what you're describing has already happened to football games. You know what I mean? It's objectively a better experience to watch an NFL game from home. You know what I mean? Like my food is cheaper, my drinks are cheaper, my experience is more customized to what I want. I have a better view of the game. I have a better understanding of what's going on. I'm not freezing cold. I'm not, you know what I mean? Like there's a million ways you can fill that out. And yet every week people choose to go to live games because it's a different experience that they prefer, right? Because like there's something about rubbing shoulders with people that they really enjoy. I think there will always be a hunger for live in-person churches among a demographic of the population. That will always be the case. But I think my broader answer to that is, again, despite the fact that we've built buildings and buildings and buildings and buildings and buildings, and at one point the Catholic Church had a building on every block. That was their goal, and they've recently begun to close smaller parishes as they realize that people have more mobility, right, in vehicles, and they can drive to a regional parish, right, and that better equips that regional parish to reach that area. Where was I going with that? The point is that despite all of that, the statistics say that we are nowhere near reaching everyone, right? Like it's just true. Like, in fact, we're going the other way. Or I tend to interpret that data as saying people are just being more honest. Like I don't think less people are actually Christians, as most Christians would define the word Christian. I think people are just more willing to say, like, no, I'm not a Christian. You know what I mean? So like in other words, I don't think the nuns are like former committed Christians. I think the nuns are like former Christmas and Easter Christians who have said like, oh yeah, this isn't important to me. And like they've just admitted reality to
And
themselves.
just because it's more socially acceptable to not be Christian now,
Right,
it's
right.
yeah.
Right. So I think it's just more clear. But I also think it just goes to say, like, oh well, what happens if um what you're basically saying is, and I'm not saying you're saying this, because again, you're saying that I'm not saying this, but like
Yeah.
what you're saying is that when Jesus said the harvest is plentiful but the workers are few, is you're saying, well, no, Jesus, it's the other way now. Now there's too many workers and there's not
And
enough harvest.
maybe I phrased the question wrong. What I'm getting at is that no, if we agree that online church is a viable and needed source, like resource for reaching the lost, but it's basically there's no limit on the number of pews I can have on an online church. There's no other than time zone, right? Other
Right.
than just when I can tune in because I'm awake or asleep, or it's just not Sunday for me or something like that because I'm in Australia. But like why would someone choose to be part of, like, you're in the Lancaster area, so why, if I live in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, why would I choose to log in to see the online church for Grace Community Church instead of Elevation or instead of Life Church or instead of some of these like big names that are huge, that are arguably using the space, let's say better, like objectively
Yeah.
just better, like they're just doing a
Yeah.
more excellent production, Um,
I
you
think that
know,
comes down to it's just a different experience. I mean, because so in Lancaster County, there's in terms of churches over 1,000 people. There's us, there's the worship center, there's Mannheim Brethren Christ Church, and there's LCBC that has like 15,000 people or something, like
sure.
across multiple campuses. So the same question could be asked: if somebody lives 15 minutes from us and 15 minutes from LCBC, why would they choose us? You know what I mean? Which like has happened. Like people have said, "Oh, I was going to LCBC, really wasn't my scene, so I started coming here." And the reasons vary. The reasons are like, "Oh, I feel like I'm seen here. I feel like I'm known here. Oh, I feel like I connect better with the sermons." You know what I mean? It's. I mean, for the same reason anybody would pick any church. I think people will pick online churches. Now, what you're saying is valid in that um, you know, en masse, is there room for everybody? Um, and I think that there is, especially since there is no real cost to running an online church beyond just like the initial equipment. As much as there's room for churches that have 20 people on a Sunday morning, there's room for small online churches. And obviously there will be attrition, just like there is. I mean, we close churches every year, like physical churches. But and I think that we've seen. I don't have the data to back this up, but I think we've seen a centralization of smaller churches closing and larger what really are now considered mega churches. Like our church size is technically considered a mega church in terms of online churches because we have over 1,200 people, or not online churches, in terms of churches because we have over 1,200 people. Now, like, is some of that transfer growth? Yeah, I mean that's inevitable. But we're not intentionally going out and closing other churches. But churches kind of come and go, and you hope that places can continue to be viable, but that's not always the reality. And I think the same is true in an online space.
Yeah, cool. Um, I just have one more question, if that's okay.
Sure, man, I'm good.
Okay. So what are some like next steps for you guys? Are you thinking, I mean, nothing, you got to like commit to saying we're definitely doing this, but like dreaming big or just following up with this launch from only 2 weeks ago.
Only
What,
2 weeks ago.
how do you see like some stuff developing in the future for you guys with the online campus?
Yeah, so small dreaming. We want to do our membership course online, and I don't know. So I'm working with our associate pastor to figure out what does it look like to offer a membership course through Zoom. That's kind of like the next thing that I want to mess with. Big picture, I've asked myself, what does it look like to kind of land a kids ministry in this space? Like, is there a way I could create a curated kids experience that kids watch while their parents watch the service? And can I target it to like a YouTube playlist that they could watch on their phone or something, that like you can hand a kid a tablet or a phone and they can go to a kids service or something. And then I think other big dream thing, I would love to see us develop the ability to do kind of like a microsite thing where somebody says, well, I'm not really ready to come into your physical space, or I kind of live too far away. I live like 30 minutes. What does it look like for me to find community? And we say, oh, we'll invite your friends and neighbors to your house and we'll resource you almost as if you're a site. And you guys can watch church together, and we'll train you to almost become like a pastor to that small group of people. So I would say those are kind of the things that are on my mind as I kind of wrestle with it.
Yeah, that's cool. That's
Yeah,
encouraging.
man. No, it is really. I'm excited about it.
I don't know. Is there anything else you feel like adding on before I close off the
Yeah,
recording?
I just want to double back. I felt like I was overly critical when we were looking at those YouTube options, and I hope that I didn't reflect myself the wrong way. I don't think anybody is unqualified to teach the Bible. My point was to say, why are people who would not say it is their vocational calling to occupy this space the ones that are primarily occupying this space?
Right. Yeah.
And so I hope that came across the right way, and
Yeah, I understood what you meant by that. And I think like, retcon, looking back on that, I mean, I think it would be fair to say you're looking at that as just saying why is the church not taking advantage of this space? And you see these people as evidence, regardless, obviously you have no idea what their actual background is, but they're not presenting themselves as, hey, I'm leading this church and here's some videos that we're producing,
Right.
to help our community and anyone else that would like it. They're
Right.
presenting their personal lives. They're presenting, you know, this is something that I'm doing. Um, just maybe they feel called to do it in that way, but it's not being pushed forward by what we would say is the church.
Yeah, and I guess that was kind of my point, is if you would agree that it is the mission of the church to help make the Bible accessible to people, then why is it that when I search how to study the Bible, I don't see a church, I see, a YouTube personality, whomever that
Right.
YouTube personality is.
Right.
I just want to be clear, I'm not somebody who believes that like women can't teach men or any
Right.
other thing you could have gathered from that. And
Sure.
yeah,
No,
so
I get what you mean. I think it would be like, looking at that is to say you may find, and I think you already do, not to the extent that we're talking about it, but like you'll find full-time staff social media people, obviously, right? But
right.
it's more of like, oh, I'm managing posts, I'm creating graphics, and I'm posting them, I'm making sure our live feed looks right, and all that stuff. But like
Well,
actually having like a YouTube personality type person on staff that's just
yeah.
creating content for your church.
Well, as opposed to like marketing, and I think Brady Shear says this well, and he talks about if I'm following a comedian on, I could say who he is. Unfortunately, the story of the rest of the story is now kind of out there about this individual, but he was talking about John Christ, and he said if I if I'm following John Christ on Facebook, and he posts something funny, I say, oh, that's a funny post. And then he posts something else funny. I say, oh, that's another funny post. And then by the time he posts the third or fourth thing, I say, oh, John Christ is a funny person, or John Christ is a creative writer. So when we talk about church social media or church content, and we say, as opposed to just like, check out our events, check out our events, check out our events, check out our events, come to our church, check out our, you know what I mean?
Right.
If we say, oh, that's a helpful piece of content, and then who knows what it is, who knows if it's just something as simple as, hey, here's a video from Bible Project explaining how to understand the book of Mark, you know what I mean?
Sure.
And then I post something else and they say, oh, that's a helpful, that really affects my life, and it's about parenting as a Christian or something. And then I post another post. Like eventually what they come to believe is, oh, Grace Community Church is a helpful church that cares about my day-to-day life. And I think it's just true, man,
Yeah.
But no, thank you for letting me clarify that. I don't want to make it seem like I'm, a dinosaur in my views or anything like that, or that that a mom blogger wouldn't be qualified to talk about teaching the Bible. But my point more so is like, here's a chance, like this should be the church's lane. And because we've vacated it, it now can be occupied by anyone.
Right.
And the fact is that as we go through there, we say, oh, well, I don't know what this person's going to teach. And the truth is that is because we've chosen not to occupy the space. It's more likely that our people and our future people will get their education on how to study the Bible, not from a source that we trust or from us, but from a source that we look at and we say, well, I'm not really sure. You know what I mean?
Right.
This could
Right.
be a great source. This could be a terrible source.
Right.
And what room do we have to even criticize that source if we're not even rolling something out there? You
Right.
know what I mean?
We could
It's
go back to the example of looking up YouTube videos for anything else.
right,
Like if let's say I'm a certified Chevy mechanic, right? I work at a dealership or whatever, and there's a problem with a car, and some guy figures out a way to resolve it. That's not exactly the best way to do it, but it works and it solves a
right,
problem, at least momentarily. He posts a video, people find it, and it works for them too. But as a certified car mechanic for Chevy, I know, hey, wait a minute, that's actually only solving part of the problem. There's this bigger issue going on. And if you
right,
really knew the ins and outs of this vehicle, like I do, because I've studied it, because it's my profession, this is what I do, you'd know that,
right.
And so it's not saying that what that person did, we just don't know.
Right. Right.
because we have no real way to tell.
Yeah.
No, that's good.
Yeah, exactly, man. All right, cool. Well, hey, I appreciate it. I always love talking about this stuff. If you have a meeting about an hour and a half, if you wanna grab me back in, I'm happy to take a call.
Yeah, I'll let you know. I'm hoping that part of the I'm gonna kill the recording.